Welcome to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer.
And I'm Robert Buccellato.
So, Robert, let's talk about Claude Kirk, who is one of the most controversial governors in Florida history, maybe the most colorful governor in Florida history, was our first Republican governor after Reconstruction. Like everybody in Florida outside of Pinellas County in the late 1950s, he's a registered Democrat, but he re-registers as a Republican fairly early in 1960 and builds a political movement behind him and becomes really kind of the manifestation of angry Florida in the 1966 race, when he thinks he's going to be running against Hayden Burns, right? And he ends up running against Robert King High, the very liberal mayor of Miami, who ran against the sitting governor Hayden Burns and defeated him in a runoff. And so he ends up winning 55-45 against Robert King High in an election where hundreds of thousands of Floridians who had never voted for a Republican for any office before cast their ballots for Claude Kirk. And it was a tsunami in terms of Florida politics and gave Republicans high hopes that Florida could be a state they realign rather quickly after that. And Kirk was a guy who had never been in office. He had never, right? He was not someone who was a politician in a state where politics was a religion. And as V.O. Key had put in his seminal work in the late 1940s, every man for himself in Florida.
Before Rick Scott, the only other person that had ever done it was Claude Kirk. He had never run for anything with the exception of the U.S. Senate. He had never served anywhere except for his one term as governor. So there was always this view, if you didn't know the circumstances of 1966, to wonder, how did this happen? And I remember asking my granddad, and my granddad just would shrug it off and say he was a fluke. And when you start to think about it, it really was a perfect storm. You had the civil rights, which was dividing Democrats in this state. You had the Nixon factor, the fact that Nixon was so popular, and by extension, moderate Republicans and conservative Republicans were becoming a force. And it was that type of Republican that was attracting conservative Democrats. But then you add this huge divisive primary that you had just mentioned. And then you had this young, charismatic, attractive businessman, Claude Kirk. And it just kind of came out of nowhere. You had Democrats winning in places that Democrats had Republicans winning in areas where Republicans never won. Where, the last Republican to win split rails with Abe Lincoln. And then here they were winning. And you saw this sort of pact between panhandle Democrats and Claude Kirk. And he very quickly, with the sort of bombastic flamboyancy of his nature, made them regret that pact. Because immediately he got elected and sworn in, and then he sent the entire legislature into a special session without telling the leadership, which was shocking because at the time, everybody was supposed to meet in a few months, and now they had to sort of drop everything and come to Tallahassee in a few days. And I think the divorce rate in that first term was just appalling because they went from 60 days to like 180 days. And one representative famously said, 60 days is enough time to have an affair. 160 days is enough time to fall in love. And so you saw these people who, wanted to actually work in their real jobs have to go to Tallahassee for a special session. And they weren't able to resolve anything because Claude Kirk, immediately after he called special session, took his new bride and went off on a honeymoon, on a vacation. So that was just the kind of leader he was. He was only interested in Claude Kirk. He was only interested in Claude Kirk's political persuasion. The best comparison that you would have to it modern times is a Donald Trump with a better sense of humor. The
Trump comparison is good because he had no particular political ideology at all. Like Donald Trump. Donald Trump, I hear Democrats say, Donald Trump's the most conservative. No, he's not. In fact, I've argued he's kind of a leftist on economics, but his economics, he's just very flexible, right? He's a Trumpist, right? He's not a liberal. He's not a conservative. He's not a Republican. He's a registered Republican. But Kirk was very similar, right? He had no fixed ideology, which is why, we look back on the Kirk years, and there were some things that went right during the Kirk years. There's a whole lot and he's a guy that had absolutely no consistency whatsoever in his ideology, in his policy preferences, and what he believed, was easily influenced by outsiders, a lot like our former and future president, Donald Trump, as we discussed this months before Trump is to take office again. Went wrong. I guess the one consistent thing he was consistent on was segregation, and he used code words, and he talked about crime, and some of these themes were things that Nixon then hit on in 68. But I don't know if Kirk was really a segregationist. I just think he knew where the public opinion was in Florida. He knew he had beaten Robert King High because Robert King High was very liberal, and Robert King High had been an advocate for civil rights, and it upset the establishment order in the Democratic Party, where Hayden Burns had been the incumbent governor, and Hayden Burns was a racist, not just a segregationist, but a racist. And I don't know that Kirk was a racist or even really a segregationist.
He was able to, without blushing in his later years, claim that he was this steward of civil rights reform.
Yes.
That he was this great, heroic character, when, the reality was that he, ran 2 gubernatorial elections basically on, cutting taxes and busing. Being
right. Busing was 1970. Yeah.
Yeah. So, he really, and he was pretty, he wasn't like a Lester Maddox. He wouldn't come out and say like, I ain't having them at my table or anything, but he would, his ads were filled with, white housewives talking about how idiotic it was that their children would have to drive 10 miles on a bus to some other school. And you got the message.
Yeah, Robert, in 1970, he gets challenged from the left in the Republican primary by Jack Eckert, who was the drugstore magnate, right? Eckert Drugs, Eckert College. Jack Eckert from St. Petersburg, who had been, this kind of Pennsylvania Republican, Hugh Scott type, Richard Schweiker, liberal Republican. So he's facing this guy, this country club Republican who's pretty liberal, and he goes full on racist. That's when Kirk kind of showed his colors. It became all about race. And the softness of the Eckards and the country club Republicans on the race issue and on our customs from Florida. And Eckerd, to his credit, wouldn't get down in the mud with him. Jack Eckerd was was a dignified man. A pure conservative, pure market conservative, right? Free market capitalist conservative, but pretty liberal on things like civil rights. And Kirk beat him as a result. And I don't think Kirk was actually even that racist, right? I think he just did it because this is how he beat back Jack Eckerd.
I'm sure in his own way he was probably a prejudiced man. But, I don't think that he was, particularly violent towards African Americans. But, if it meant that, it was a way for him to win an election, sure, he would do it. He had no qualms whatsoever about being whatever you wanted him to be, as long as he made money off of it, got some sort of notoriety, and had power. He would do whatever he wanted.
Robert, this issue of the death penalty is interesting because Florida governors at the time, Florida politicians, most of them were against it. Hayden Burns, his predecessor, was a segregationist, was a racist, in my opinion, flat out racist. His predecessor was Ferris Bryant, who had been Speaker of the House, was from Ocala, was a segregationist. But these guys were all religious, and they didn't support the death penalty. But Kirk, that was part of his law and order message. Leroy Collins had been staunchly against the death penalty. His successor, Reuben Askew, would be against it. But he made it an issue in Florida again. And obviously, Florida has become the execution state as a result. A lot of people, a lot of analysts say he brought that issue into the body politic just because of race. It was another way of coding the racism.
And you'd see a prominent, I forget his name now, but African-American author and sort of like a philosopher come into Florida. And Claude Kirk would go and sit in the audience. And if he heard something he didn't like, he'd come and he'd break it up. That was just the kind of guy that he was. And the reason why he did it wasn't because he necessarily disagreed with what the man was saying. He was going to get notoriety for it, and it was going to win him votes. And one thing about Claude Kirk that everybody needs to understand is the second he got into the governor's mansion, he started running for either the presidency or the vice presidency. Yes. And he started making deals with people to start up this slush fund of, friends for Claude Kirk. And he would travel around the country and then around the world, basically jet setting, promoting himself. In his eyes, he was promoting Florida. But he would do these things like, interrupt African-American celebrities who would come to Florida to give lectures or speeches because it was good for him politically. He would shake hands with a man on death row and say to him to his face, and of course the man was African-American. He would say, if I had it my way, I'm going to put you to death. And he wouldn't be anything but candid with you because that was what his supporters wanted.
Of course, he wanted to be the vice presidential nominee in 1968 for Nixon and was seriously considered. The convention, RNC, Republican National Convention, was in Miami that year. So it was actually, a good location for him, obviously. So in theory, it gave Kirk a logistical advantage. And actually, one of the things that happened during this convention was the 1968 Miami riot. Not as big as the Chicago, what happened at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, but not on the same scale, but some similar thing that Kirk had a hard time containing. I think we're going to run a podcast on that next week, actually. But what has subsequently come out also about the 68 convention is that the logistical advantage Kirk thought he had because it was in Miami ended up backfiring. Not only the riots down the road a bit, which we're going to talk about next week. But Robert, Florida Republicans obviously were helping to run the convention, right? Because it was in Florida, and a lot of them came to the Nixon staff and those who were with President then former Vice President Nixon, soon to be President Nixon, saying, "Look, Claude Kirk is an embarrassment, man. You can't put him on the national ticket. You can't put him on." He'll embarrass us. We'll end up losing to the Democrats. The Democratic nominee would end up being Hubert Humphrey. Nixon's choice of Spiro Agnew, though, was one of the most embarrassing vice presidential choices in American history. One of the worst choices, at least since the vice presidency became sort of a relevant office. I tend to think there have been some other ones. Dan Quayle. I think J.D. Vance is going to be really bad, in my opinion. I mean, I thought Trump did well with his first vice president, Mike Pence, who As an aside, I once introduced Mike Pence at a press conference. Had nothing to do with politics, right? It was in the soccer role, but Pence. I don't agree with his politics, but he's a guy that I respected a lot. I knew of him in the U.S. House, actually. But anyway, like Kirk would have been an embarrassment, but Agnew was probably an even bigger embarrassment. But Kirk, really, the convention week goes very badly for him. We're going to talk more about those riots next week, and he doesn't end up on the ticket. And quite frankly, he had all these problems with other Republicans, Jack Eckerd, Bill Kramer, the congressman. I think he was the only Republican congressman. I think by that time, Herbert Burke from Broward County had been J. Herbert Burke from Broward County had been elected. But Bill Kramer from St. Petersburg, he had been the first Republican congressman in our delegation. All kinds of problems between Kirk and other Republicans in the state.
Became pretty crazy with this notion of power and title. He was at famously a cocktail party, and somebody asked him, what he was going to do after the governorship, and he said, dictator. As a joke. But to add to what you were saying, the Republicans in the state really couldn't stand him after a while. And, he would famously go to these Republican fundraisers, and he would spend the whole night basically crashing conversations and reintroducing himself. And by then, he was a terrible fall-down alcoholic. And it was becoming pretty embarrassing. And both of them tried very, very hard to bring up primary challenges against the other. Famously, Claude Kirk tried really, really hard to get his lieutenant governor to run against Kramer. And, Osborne was a pretty, staple Republican. He was a company man. And he just said, look, I'm not going to do it. But that was pretty much, I think, as much of a obsession to him to win re-election was to knock down Kramer. And they really had an opportunity, because Nixon was incredibly popular, to really make a lot of gains. And because these two guys just were not cooperating, like you said, it stinted the party's outreach for at least 10 years.
Yeah, we tend to think of Florida history very linearly now, that civil rights happens, Kirk gets elected in 66, and Gurney gets elected in 68 to the U.S. Senate, and it's an upward trajectory for the Republican Party. But that's actually not true. After massive gains in the legislature in the 66 and 68 election, Kirk's buffoonery and divisions of the Republican Party and authoritarian instincts put the Republicans in a place where they had more seats in the state Senate in 1968 than they did in 1985, right? They ended up losing a lot of the quick gains they'd made after civil rights and massive resistance and white disenchantment with the Democratic Party. The Democrats ended up winning back a lot of those seats, won back a lot of the seats in the state house as well. And quite honestly, Kirk's behavior from 1968 onwards ended up costing the Republicans probably 10 years of their advancement. So we talk about the Republican gains and gaining control of the state house in 96 and flipping the governorship and the state cabinet in 98. All of that probably happens a decade earlier, if not even sooner, if not for Claude Kirk. Really something else. But we'll be back next week, Robert, with talking about that 68